What's the White House's new hydrogen initiative? And does supplementing burning wood pellets for coal reduce overall emissions? Welcome to the Climate Recap from the Beckisphere Climate Corner, your go-to place for international and US-based climate news. I'm Becky Hogue, a climate communicator. Today is Monday, September 26th. Let's jump right into today's news. Let's start with some extreme weather events. Fiona, now a post-tropical storm, hit several parts of the Atlantic Canada over the weekend, knocking the power out for residents in Nova Scotia. 4 other provinces were impacted by infrastructure and environmental damage. The federal government mobilized the Canadian Armed Forces to help with recovery efforts. Speaking of Fiona, U.S. President Biden announced the federal government would pay for 100% of Hurricane Fiona's recovery costs for Puerto Rico for the next month. This announcement came after he declared a state of emergency on Puerto Rico, which was hit by the hurricane. It knocked the whole island's power out and tore away infrastructure built after Hurricane Maria. Hurricane Maria was a Category 5 that ripped through Puerto Rico in 2016. It killed around 3,000 people, either directly or indirectly due to inadequate living conditions. The previous administration and the local government did not do a good job prioritizing and implementing recovery efforts. This restoration money will go towards the cost of debris removal, power and water infrastructure restoration, shelter, and food for the next month. Meanwhile, Alaskan tribal communities recently hit by Typhoon Merbok are now worried about their food supplies. Merbok was the strongest storm ever recorded in the Bering Sea during September. It caused flooding, power outages, and damaged essential infrastructure. When the power is out, food spoils faster. 1 in 9 people living in Alaska is thought to be food insecure, according to the nonprofit Feeding America. Nearly half of the indigenous population is food insecure. Climate change is resulting in the loss of traditional food sources. Additionally, coastal communities are concerned about how Merbok impacted protective coastal berms. This storm likely made these communities more vulnerable to sea level rise-induced flooding. Let's check out a climate study. We're pretty sure how to reduce about 90% of electricity-related emissions, but that last 10% can be tricky. A recent study published in the journal Joule looked at the pros and cons of 6 different proposed ways to get the U.S.'s electricity grid the rest of the way there to net zero emissions. They are as followed. Wind and solar power with short-term energy storage and an expansion of interstate power lines. Pros: low cost and technologically available. Cons: requires attached battery storage and more transmission lines, which can raise the costs. Other renewables, including geothermal, hydropower, and biomass. Pros: technologically available and energy can be produced around the clock. Cons: can be very expensive and come with their own unique problems. Nuclear, along with fossil fuels and carbon capture. Pros: energy can be produced around the clock. Cons: could be very expensive and carbon capture has so far been unreliable. Long-duration energy storage using hydrogen. Pros: could reduce the amount of additional energy needed to be produced. Cons: could be very expensive, leaking hydrogen, and the most behind in the way of technological development. Carbon dioxide removal. Pros: could help reduce emissions in hard-to-decarbonize sectors, and there's a variety of ways to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Cons: expensive and so far unreliable. Reducing electricity demand. Pros: cheaper for everyone. Cons: can be complicated to implement and requires buy-in. Which of these methods do you think is the best way to get us the rest of the way there? Let me know in the comment section below if you're on YouTube. Time for some climate victories. The White House just launched a new initiative that opens $7 billion to establish 10 regional hydrogen hubs. At least one will be blue, meaning the hydrogen comes as a byproduct of natural gas. One will be green, meaning it's made via clean energy. And one will be pink, meaning it's using nuclear energy. Hydrogen is a useful form of energy because it can help decrease emissions in hard-to-decarbonize sectors like aviation and cement more effectively than wind and solar. But it really needs to be developed and stored near where it's needed to reduce leaks as much as possible. When leaked, hydrogen binds with other chemicals in the atmosphere that would otherwise take methane out of the atmosphere, meaning it indirectly contributes to climate change. Meanwhile, the U.S. National Railroad Passenger Corporation, also known as Amtrak, announced plans to be net zero emissions by 2045. Public transportation on its own reduces travel emissions greatly, but lowering the emissions of public transport too is even better. Amtrak runs 300 trains in more than 500 destinations daily. And California's Air Resources Board unanimously voted to ban the sale of new gas furnaces and heaters starting in 2030. This means the state's agencies must draft rules to be voted on by 2025. Passing a bill like this would be a first for a state in the U.S. This is an important way to reduce fossil fuel reliance, reduce energy costs, and reduce methane, which can leak out of these appliances when they're off. We have quite a few climate fails today, unfortunately. China has reportedly built 14 coal plants abroad since vowing to no longer finance offshore coal projects during the UN General Assembly meeting a year ago. This is according to the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air and People of Asia for Climate Solutions. Granted, most of these projects were already in process when he made that promise, but if every project that was recently or soon to be completed entered the grid, they would emit more greenhouse gases than the Philippines, or about 140 million tons of CO2 a year in total. 27 more projects are getting close to finishing. China did cancel 26 projects since that announcement, and 33 more could be canceled if not given permits or financing. Not finishing these projects would reduce 341 million tons of CO2 a year. Over in Indonesia, a plan to reduce how much coal it burns by supplementing 10% of it with burning wood pellets or biomass is unsurprisingly causing a spike in the country's deforestation rate. This deforestation and wood burning trend will actually result in over 4 times the emissions as just burning coal, according to Trend Asia. Indonesia has one of the largest tropical rainforests in the world, which is important for both biodiversity and keeping the planetary and regional climate stable. Despite wood pellets not actually being a true method of decarbonizing, the Indonesian government has recently given regulations in support of biomass production. Meanwhile, India plans to boost its coal power fleet by 25% by 2030 to keep up with its growing energy demand. Prime Minister Modi said he's prioritizing energy reliability over transitioning to clean energy and blames this decision on developed countries not providing more money to the transition effort. That would mean adding 56 gigawatts of coal power to its grid unless battery storage technology becomes cheaper. The country says it's still pursuing its plan to add 500 gigawatts of clean energy to the grid by 2030 as well. The country's goal is to peak emissions by 2030 to reach net zero emissions by 2070. The new UK Prime Minister, Truss, is thinking wicked thoughts. The Guardian reported the government is considering making fracking sites nationally important infrastructure, which would allow them to bypass local community approval. This would break a campaign promise to allow communities to choose whether to have a fracking site near them. These sites pollute air and water, contribute to climate change through carbon and methane emissions, and create fractures in the ground, which can slip, causing earthquakes. The one grain of hope was that even if Truss brought back fracking, the consistently low public support for this form of fossil fuel extraction would keep it from actually making a comeback. But Truss's new energy minister, Rees-Mogg, who has a background in climate dismissal, refused to agree to allow communities to blacklist fracking projects, instead saying the people nearby will be quote-unquote compensated. That is not the same thing. In addition to this shady behavior, Rees-Mogg has reportedly watered down plans to block new oil and gas projects in the North Sea due to them being inconsistent with the UK's climate goals. Instead, the energy minister is likely to approve over 100 new lease sales. Meanwhile, UK climate activists have been held in jail for up to 6 months before their trials, according to The Guardian. Over in the US, Duke Energy, which provides electricity to 6 states, leaks its electrical insulator, sulfur hexafluoride, or SF6, from substations at more than 5 times the rate of other US utility companies, according to the company's mandated reports filed for the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. According to Inside Climate News and NBC News, who reviewed the data, Duke has been above the average emissions rate for the last 6 or 7 years, leaking about 5.2% of its SF6 supply. The EPA doesn't regulate greenhouse gases, but still requests information on them and started a voluntary SF6 emissions reduction program. A single pound of SF6 heats the planet up as much as 25,200 pounds of carbon dioxide. According to the UN Governmental Panel on Climate Change, it remains in the atmosphere for 3,200 years. The EPA calls them essentially permanent additions to the atmosphere. What's crazy is this stuff used to be used to fill race car tires, tennis balls, and even Nike Air Max shoes. Now, electrical utilities are the main users of this gas. In 2020, just 2 of Duke's energy facilities leaked nearly 11 metric tons of SF6, which is enough atmospheric warming for 59,000 cars driving for a year. Put a different way, these same 2 states' facilities emitted 119 tons of SF6 over the last decade, which is worth 500,000 cars' emissions over the span of a year. A lot of Duke's equipment is from the 1970s, and their spokesperson says they're working to replace their equipment. Utility companies need to stop using SF6 though, or these emissions will increase into the future when we are expected to need 2 to 5 times the transmission capacity as now. Currently, 88 utility companies are working with the EPA to reduce SF6 use. I want to end today's episode with more on the developing story I talked about on Friday. The World Bank chief Malpass said it was clear that humans were causing the planet to warm during a recent staff meeting. Quote, "On climate change, it's clear that greenhouse gas emissions from human activities are causing climate change, and that the sharp increase in the use of coal, diesel, and heavy fuel oil in both advanced economies and developing countries is creating another wave of the climate crisis. Anything seen in a different light is incorrect and regrettable." Now, was that so hard? He pointed to the bank's work on climate resiliency and clean energy transition spaces. And that was your climate recap for Monday, September 26th. If you like the work I do, please follow this podcast, give it a 5-star rating, leave a review, and consider checking out the Beckisphere Climate Corner YouTube channel. Remember to talk about the climate crisis every single day and to support your local news organizations. Bye for now.